Welcome to K-Talk Blackletter series, lesson number 8. I'm Dan O'Gorman, associate professor at Barry University School of Law.
And I'm Steve Maxwell, director of academic achievement and lecturer in law at the University of Miami School of Law.
And in lesson number 8, we are going to talk about option contracts, continuing our discussion of contract formation. Steve, I think this is a topic that confuses a lot of students. What do you think?
It's like a contract within a contract is a lot of contracts.
One contract, they have trouble with one contract, and now we're throwing in another contract to it, a subsidiary contract. So let's hope that we can make this more understandable for the students. I view this as an aspect of acceptance, actually. So we know that we talked about termination of the power of acceptance last time. I also think, of course, that is part of acceptance. I actually tell my students to think of having the power of acceptance as one of the elements of acceptance, that you got to manifest assent, you got to be an offeree, it's got to be to the terms of the offer, it's got to be in the manner invited or required by the offeror. You must have the power of acceptance at the time you enter into the contract. And I like to think of option contracts as a subset issue with whether or not the offeree has the power of acceptance, because option contracts are going to take many of those events we talked about last time, most of those events that would ordinarily terminate the power of acceptance, and mean they do not terminate the power of acceptance. So they allow the offeree to do a lot of things, to have things happen. Ordinarily, power of acceptance would be gone. But if you have a so-called option contract, then those events do not terminate the power of acceptance. So as you may recall from lesson number 7, things that will terminate the power of acceptance include offer or offeree death or legal incapacity, revocation, rejection, counter offer, lapse of time, non-occurrence of a condition. Here's the good news for the offeree. If the offer includes an option contract, the only ones of those events that will terminate the power of acceptance are lapse of time and the non-occurrence of a condition. Those other events now, revocation, ineffective, will not terminate your power of acceptance. You offeree can make a counteroffer, will not terminate the power of acceptance if you have an option contract. You can even reject the offer, will not terminate the power of acceptance. There's a little wrinkle there, that if the offeror relies upon the rejection, it was reasonable to rely upon the rejection, the offeree might be stopped from enforcing the contract. But general rule is all these events, other than lapse of time, non-occurrence, all of a sudden, they are not having this effect of terminating the power of acceptance. So if you think about it, Steve, an option contract is an awesome thing, is it not, for an offeree to have?
It seems like a way to cling to power of acceptance. Like they don't lose it, they can cling to that power.
You are absolutely right. You get to hold on to the power. Well, Steve, if you want to look, this is America, Steve. There's a price for everything, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Almost everything. If you want to be able to hold on to that power, that's all. You want a lot of power. If you want to hold on to the power, you generally are going to have to pay the price for being able to hold on to that power. It's almost like a superpower.
Absolutely, yes. But of course, you've got to give something up to get a power. This is like that evil side, the evil superhero who's has to do something in exchange, like that soul to the devil to get the power.
It's like the balance of the world. You don't want to upset the equilibrium, right? It's all a zero-sum game, Steve, right? We're not creating anything. If you want to get something, you just got to do an exchange. So option contract is what it boils down to. An option contract is when there is an offer that is considered irrevocable. They're often called irrevocable offers. And if that's true, That's a fair way to think of an option contract. Then that necessarily would mean that if there isn't an option contract, you would call the offer a revocable offer. A lot of people use that phrase. To me, it's sort of like obvious that offers are revocable unless, so to call it a revocable offer is kind of weird to me, but a lot of people call them revocable offers. So your typical offer is a quote revocable offer. Remember we talked about last time, general rule is the offeror can revoke their offer, no questions asked, right? What we thought of pull the string, pull that ball back, no problem. Even if you've told the other side that they have X amount of time to consider the offer remains revocable. Now, the phrase irrevocable offer, I want to caution students, it is a pretty good characterization of it. Remember how I said that the power of an option contract is that most of those events that would terminate the power of acceptance no longer terminate the power of acceptance. And I mentioned there not only revocation. So not only is revocation off the table as a way to terminate the power of acceptance, but also rejection and counter offer and even death would not terminate the power of acceptance. Lapse of time would, non-occurrence of a condition would. But so don't be lulled into thinking that the phrase irrevocable offer that's often used to describe option contracts necessarily means that the only event that now does not terminate the power of acceptance as a result of it is revocation. That's the most common situation. I make an offer, I try to revoke it, there's an option contract, it's ineffective, but it is not the only situation where the option contract will have bite, so to speak. But let's talk about the price, because he said, look, there's a price to be paid. So the traditional way to create an option contract, a so-called irrevocable offer, is for the offeree to pay money for that irrevocable nature. And an option contract essentially is a promise to keep an offer open for a period of time, and the promise becomes legally binding for some reason. Now, we know that in general, a promise in and of itself is not legally binding. There may be a moral obligation to keep a promise, but there is a difference between a moral obligation and a legal obligation. And a promise to keep an offer open, for the most part, is treated like any other promise in contract law. In and of itself, it's not legally binding. I promise to keep an offer open for 2 weeks. The mere fact that I've made that promise to you, that might mean I'm morally obligated to keep it open for 2 weeks, but in and of itself, it doesn't mean that I am legally obligated to keep it open for 2 weeks. So we treat promises to keep an offer open like other promises. Something extra is necessary. And now the question becomes, what is that? Well, probably, I would say, 98% of the time, the way that happens is the promisee, the offeree, gives consideration to the offeror in exchange for that promise to keep the offer open. So, for example, Steve, you own a parcel of land. You offer to sell it to me, and I want time to think about it. I need about 2 weeks. I don't know if this is a good offer or not. Maybe I don't know what I'm going to do with the land. Do I need it? I don't know. I want time to think about it, but I'm nervous, right? Why am I nervous, Steve? So I need 2 weeks, but what am I nervous about? Probably
Because I could probably sell it to somebody else in those 2 weeks.
exactly right. Oh, a real quick note about the last episode. We talked about indirect revocation, because this is one that trips up students. And we talked about how when the offeree receives information from a reliable source that the offeror is no longer interested in entering into a deal with them. And an example would be you learn as the offeree that they've sold the land to a third party. That would be an indirect revocation. Well, remember, revocation, whether it's direct or indirect, the receipt rule is still in play, that a revocation is only effective to terminate the power of acceptance upon receipt. So if you sell your land to a third party, Steve, it behooves you to get that information to any offerees. Students often say, well, how can you sell land to the same party? I'm like, no, 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 no. You're not understanding the point. The question isn't, can you sell land to two people? The question is, have you contracted to sell land to two people? It's a different question.
Absolutely.
And you can. Only one person. Look, this is not Solomon's baby or whatever. You're not going to, you're not going to split the land, but you are one party will get the land and the other party will get damages. The promisor will have to perform twice in a sense. They will have to specifically perform for one party, and then the other one they'll have to do what we call a substitutional remedy of performance. They'll have to pay damages. So they're essentially performing twice. So watch out. If you as the offeror don't want to contract with somebody, don't assume simply contracting with a third party in and of itself is enough to be a revocation. And it's impossible. How can I be stuck? And it's a non-occurrence of a condition. No, no, no. It is not. You got to get that notice to the offeree. But you're absolutely right, Steve. So I'm nervous as the offeree that you might sell your land to a third party and give me notice that you've done so. And so I would like you to take that land off the market for 2 weeks while I think about it. Now, what's interesting about this is if I get you to promise to do that, this is not as good a position for me as the promisee. You might think it is. Well, that's awesome. You as the offeree extracted a promise from the offeror to keep the offer open without having to pay anything. Congratulations. Oh, you are good. This is actually bad. The fact that you haven't paid anything for it and you're getting something for free, all you're getting for free is the promise. And the promise, if you got it for free and you didn't give any consideration for it, the general rule is it is not legally binding. So it actually is in your interest as the promisee, if you want to make that promise legally binding, to offer up some consideration, to pay something for it. And so if I give you, Steve, if you ask or I offer up an amount of money, which is typically the way it'd be, I will give you $200 if you take that offer off the market for 2 weeks. Well, I consider your offer and you say deal, and I give you the money. We now have, as you mentioned, we've got a second contract. Well, we only have one contract now. The second contract may or may not happen. But what's happened is you and I have created what may like to think of as a subsidiary contract to the primary contract that may or may not happen. It is I like to think of it as like a little baby contract, which is, okay, this is a bargain for exchange where what we are exchanging is your promise to keep the offer open for a period of time, here 2 weeks. And in exchange, I promise to pay you money and then I perform. So I'm not breached. So you're not off the hook. I've got you locked in. And now your promise becomes legally binding. This is the classic way to make an offer irrevocable. When I've paid for it, it's now mine. So I've bought that additional power here to not have all these events. You can't revoke it. I can reject. I can do a counter offer. No worries. That's not going to terminate the power of acceptance. Even if I died, my estate could actually accept that offer and buy the parcel of land. And presumably if I had legal incapacity, my guardian ad litem, my guardian could come in and do it. So, but I've paid for it and I've bought it. Now, here's something that's tricky for students. When they study consideration, and some of this is hard to understand until you know consideration. When they study consideration, they'll learn about something called nominal or sham or token consideration. Right? I'll give you a penny in exchange for your promise to convey this land worth $1 million. And they're going to learn that this sham or token consideration, which is just being used to create a pretense of a bargain, is not considered actual consideration and doesn't create a contract. Well, here's the rub for options. Let's say I give you a very small amount of money. I give you $100 in exchange for your promise to keep this offer to sell me land open for 2 weeks. And the land is worth, say, $5 million. everyone may say, oh, wait, this is token consideration. This is sham consideration. This is a pretense of an option contract, not a real option contract. It's a sham. What you need to remember is that what I am buying as the offeree here is I'm not buying the land for $100. I'm not buying land worth $1 million for $100. The price of the land is still $1 million. What I'm buying for $100 is the option to buy it for $1 million in the next 2 weeks and not have you take it off the table, sell it to somebody else. So that option is not worth $1 million. That option is worth much, much, much less. It's just taking, it's the value of me getting to think about it for 2 weeks and being able to relax and know you're not going to sell it to somebody else. And so a very small amount of money is generally considered consideration and not sham or a token consideration for an option, even when it is for the option to buy something that has great value. So unless it's something very, very, very small, like maybe $1, at a certain point, their statement tells us, yeah, give me a break. It's probably a sham because you're not really bargaining for the dollar. But once, if it's not crazy, crazy low, $100, that's going to work. I'd be stunned. Any court said that $100 in our hypothetical isn't good consideration for the option, because courts tend not to assess the adequacy of what's being exchanged.
Now, is this, tell me if I'm out of bounds here, but I always wondered about those where they recite the consideration, but it doesn't actually happen. Like if they say for $100, but there was never any exchange, what then?
So this is a difficult aspect. So traditionally, what courts have said was they've seemed to emphasize that it was given. So if it is very, very small, but actually handed over, this tended to push courts in the direction of, okay, we don't think this is a sham, particularly because it was given. Now, if it's though we have a case with a quarter, but it was consideration, but it was in 1907 or 1905 quarter, some more now. But so now if I handed you a quarter, for an option to buy land for $1 million, I think even the fact that I hand you the quarter, most courts would probably say, yeah, the fact that you gave it you're just good at the pretense. Congratulations. But if it's a close call at all and it's actually given, I think this pushes in favor of the court saying it's reasonable to believe that this wasn't a sham because they actually did give it. If it was going to be a sham, they probably wouldn't have given it. If they don't give it, let's say it's clearly consideration, they don't give it. It seems to me then the offeror can say, well, I could revoke it because the offeree actually breached the option contract. And this sort of gets complicated because this gets into material breach. Then you can terminate the contract. I think you can run into trouble if you don't actually hand it over. The offeror might be able to say, you're supposed to give it to me. Why didn't you give it to me? You've breached. If it's a situation where you described where it's simply, it's not given and it is recited, and no one's arguing. So like right off the bat, and then say, oh, they sell it the next day. So you don't even have an argument that like, hey, they breached by not giving it because they weren't required to give it until a reasonable time, let's say. Merely reciting consideration in there, which often have, for, $1 given and the $1 wasn't given. So now there's some trouble here because it looks really, really low and it wasn't given. This is probably going to push courts in favor of saying that this was probably just a sham. Now, the restatement disagrees with what I just said. And this might be what you're thinking of, because I know a lot of times, when people are studying for the bar, the restatement is sort of their guide and they assume the bar knows the restatement and that's what they're going to study. The restatement has a piece of black letter law that says if the parties recite a purported consideration, then it is good enough. So the mere act of writing that there is consideration given for, $1 provided, even if it's not given. And so the fact that it merely has to be recited means that you don't have to actually give it. The purported means that it could be, you could recite just a nickel. The mere act of going to the trouble of saying something, anything was given, is good enough if you write that down. The restatement felt, this is why the restatement felt this was good enough to create the option contract. The restatement and most courts believe that options are good things. Options facilitate exchanges. They allow offerees to rely upon the promise to keep the offer open, go investigate. They're good things. And we shouldn't be so tough on the rules of consideration in deciding whether or not an option should be binding, because they're not that big a deal. It's like, this is not the underlying deal. This is just a little contract, a little agreement to give them time. It's just, the sky's not going to fall if we make these legally binding. And so what it was this idea that the traditional contract law, that it treated a promise to keep an offer open exactly the same as any other promise, was carrying a good joke too far. And was kind of like, yeah, but these promises are different. These promises, we don't need to be so rough on these promises. Promises to keep offer open, they're good things. They encourage people to go in and research where this is a good deal. And if it's not legally binding, parties aren't going to want to do that. And we want people to be able to rely upon these promises, because we'll have more deals be concluded. People won't be scared to like, oh, well, I'm not going to research this because he's probably going to sell the land to a third party. So the restatement wanted to loosen up the requirements for making a promise legally, a promise to keep the offer open legally binding. And this was one way they did that, was if the parties went through the formality of reciting a purported consideration, that was good enough. We talked about in the past how formality as a general rule does not make a promise legally binding. I think we talked about the famous Kim versus Sun case, where the guy, right, with a safety pin writes a promise in blood. And even that formality isn't good enough. That formality doesn't work. My gosh, what does? Here, though, is an exception. The restatement says we think formality here with a promise to keep an offer open should work. But here's the rub, Steve. Most courts have not gotten on board with the restatement position. The restatement was more forward-looking. Some of the restatement provisions are actually aspirational. They tend to restate the law. The vast majority of what they're doing is restating the rules. It's a restatement. But every now and then, the restators would say, we would like to push the law in this direction. We think this is better. And this was one of them. But not many states have bought into this. So where we really are is formality under the common law. We'll get down to UCC firm offer in a few. Under the common law, the general rule still remains that you have to have consideration to make the option binding. Formality will not work, but courts are going to be very, very reluctant to say that consideration, no matter how small, at least if actually given, was a sham. So you almost are kind of out of formality if you're actually willing to take out the $10 bill. I don't want to say $1 because that's getting awfully small, isn't it? But I don't know. $10 bill and hand it to you for the 2 weeks for the offer for $1 million of land. I think most courts are going to be like, yeah, we're not, that's fine. That's consideration. So if you think about it, in some respects, the courts are sort of in a middle ground. They're not going all out on formality, really, like their statement is, but they're also, this is not your parents' consideration doctrine in terms of old school sham analysis kind of situation. They're going to, though actually old school like sham. No, who cares? That's me, the professor talking. Sorry, that's for professors. I want the professors out there to know I know what I'm talking about. Really, really old school is okay with sort of a token consideration. They're sort of in the middle, which is that we're not going to go all out formality, but we're also going to we're going to turn a blind eye to you. If you hand the $10, we're not going to ask a lot of questions. And if you think about it, isn't that kind of a formality? If you're willing to go through the formality of pulling out your wallet, taking out the crummy $10 bill and hand it to you, and we're willing to do all that, we're going to close our eyes and say that was consideration. That's sort of a formality, don't you think?
Yeah, and I like the real impression that I get just sort of exploring this issue is that, one, I think a new law student would be shocked to see an area of law that's just sort of this nebulous, where there's like a disagreement between the restatement and majority courts, and that there are some courts will go this way, some courts that'll go that way. And I think that's just one observation. But the second really is that maybe the law is treating an option contract as a form of lesser stakes contract, to where the threshold for forming an option contract may just be a little bit lower, because all this is enforcing the promise to hold the offer open. And no one, this doesn't obligate anyone to perform the main contract. This only keeps the offeror from being able to back out or to do something to extinguish the power of acceptance. And so it seems like this is almost a policy of, this is not as big a stake, so we're just going to have a lesser threshold, but the same contractual principles govern this little mini contract.
No doubt about it. So the same contractual principles for most courts under the common law will govern. But as you said, for policy reasons, they're going to be a little bit looser with those rules. So they're still, those rules apply. Absolutely.
Mhm.
But we all know they're sort of fudging things a bit with them. We've seen this before. Charitable subscriptions, promises to charities. So most courts will say that the same rules apply, yet we've seen traditionally courts be a lot more willing to find consideration in exchange for a promise to a charity to get it enforceable, more willing to perhaps maybe find promissory estoppel. Courts took those general rules. And so what's very interesting about it is courts will take general rules, and for policy reasons, they'll start sort of fudging a bit with them. And what will happen is the restators, who are smart people, say, look, we want to call things the way they are. We don't like fudging. If you're fudging, let's just create a rule that actually reflects what you're doing. And so the restators come along and say, look, if courts are stretching the concept of consideration for promises to charitable subscriptions, let's create a rule that just actually implements what they're doing. And the restators did that in Section 90. Many students may know Section 90, the famous restatement section that adopts promissory estoppel. Section 90, subsection 2 is a special rule for promissory estoppel when it promises to charitable subscriptions, promises to charities. And what it says is that you can enforce a promise made to a charity under promissory estoppel as long as you have the elements of promissory estoppel, but you don't actually need detrimental reliance. So the requirement of actual detrimental reliance is gone under the restatement. The theory being that it's very hard for charities to link actual detrimental reliance to a particular pledge, because they get tons of pledges. And how do you link that you did X to this pledge? And so what the restators felt was like, look, courts are stretching the concept of consideration to crazy notions. A lot of students will read a famous opinion by Judge Cardozo and dealing with Allegheny Community College, where a lot of people think Cardozo was really stretching the concept of consideration, contorting it so much it was unrecognizable, many people believe. And look, come on, don't mess with my friend consideration. Let's keep him pure. Let's create this exception. But most courts have rejected Section 90, subsection 2, and continue to treat a promise to a charity like a traditional promise, which means you've got to have consideration or detrimental reliance and the elements of promissory estoppel. But so here's the question, Steve, for our bar. So obviously we know if you're a law student and you're studying option contracts and you get to this issue of, oh, wait a second, what's this business about a recitation of purported consideration under the common law? And now that is enough. What do I do with that? I'm confused. You're telling me that most states aren't following it, but do I follow it? Obviously, what you do in your class is you do whatever your professor says. Many professors they'll just go with their statement. There's nothing wrong with that at all, because sometimes it's hard to worry about, is this a majority, is this a minority? You're just trying to teach the main rules, the basic concepts, and you don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about it. I think I was teaching that section, or I was teaching promissory restitution, which is this where you make a promise in recognition of a prior benefit. I don't know if you remember this case where the guy was falling with the bear. He's holding the barrel, and he falls. He's pushing this, he's pushing this pine block. He's pushing the barrel. Sorry, that's res ipsa loquitur. He's pushing this pine block off the second story of a warehouse, and he notices that his boss is below. Webb versus McGowan, and he grabs the pine block, and he in air moves it. I had an engineering student tell me it could actually be done. He did a little graph, or she did a little graph, moves it to avoid missing the guy. And the guy's so happy, he promises a bunch of money. And as we'll talk about with consideration, generally that's not legally binding because it's so-called past consideration. Well, the court held that should be recovery, but it was a very unusual case, and the restators liked it. And so the restators adopted this rule, which is known as often this past benefit rule, sometimes known as promissory restitution, but it was more aspirational. Not many courts have followed Webb versus McGowan and this rule. But a lot of professors are like, look, let's just go with their statement to have a baseline. And so if you're taking a class, you're a law student listening to this, you always want to figure out, okay, so these areas, if the professor is telling me, giving me the restatement to follow, and I've got Webb versus McGowan in my book, or I've got, recitation of purported consideration is enough, you go with that. If you've got you never hear about it, forget about it. If you hear about it and you got the professor saying, yeah, but not a lot of states follow this, well, then maybe it's worth a question. Okay, professor, if it's a multiple choice question, which one do we do? So watch out. When I say something is not followed by most courts, that is not necessarily an indication to students who have other professors to be like, oh, I don't have to worry about that then, because your professor might be teaching that. Oh, Steve, it looks like I lost you. Are you there? Oh, it looks like I lost Steve. So hopefully Steve will come back. So that is the option contract for consideration. Another example of an option contract that is formed through consideration is when the offeror makes an offer for a unilateral contract. When an offeror makes an offer for a unilateral contract, remember, this is when the offeror is offering something in exchange, not for a return promise, but in exchange for performance. If you do X, I will pay you X amount of money, but I'm not looking for a return promise from you. Now, what was happening was offerees would start performing. Let's say that the performance is something that takes time. And in that situation, if the performance takes time, offerees might start performing in response to this offer for a unilateral contract. And what would happen then is that the offer might come and revoke while they're in the midst of performing. And we know that the offeror, as a general rule, can revoke the offer anytime prior to acceptance. And the problem here is that the offeree does not accept an offer in response to a unilateral contract until they complete performance, not when they start performance. And courts were very concerned that this could create unfairness for offerees who started performing in response to an offer for a unilateral contract. So if I say to you, if you walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, I will pay you $100, and halfway across the Brooklyn Bridge, you all of a sudden are, and there's Steve. Steve lost there. Steve, can you hear me?
I can.
We are, and Steve, just so people understand, Steve is going above and beyond. He is in an undisclosed location, not optimal, but he's agreed to continue. The show must go on. Literally, the show must go on. And so it sounds like Steve's internet, or I'm sorry, looks like Steve's internet is a little bit spotty, but welcome back, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you. And I don't know where you are now, but I have seen this option contract tested in Florida essays for the bar exam, and it is very much in tune with what I see on this slide. And so I think you were getting ready to ask me about that, and I have seen this tested actually fairly frequently. And so what is up here on this slide, option for consideration, promissory estoppel, and UCC firm offer are very heavily tested on Florida essays. So any questions you have about that, I can answer, because this is a big ticket item.
And what students need to recognize is that what this means, if you pay for an option, and think about why we call it an option. We call it an option because the offeree has the option to accept the offer and form the contract, but the offeror has lost the power to revoke the offer. So that's why we call it an option. It is now sort of, it gives this one-sided ability to form a contract, but you've paid for that one-sided ability to do it. And so what that means is, if I've paid Steve $100 to keep that offer open for 2 weeks, now if Steve came and said within a week, I revoke that offer, that would be ineffective. It would not terminate my power of acceptance. After he says that, I can turn around and say, I accept. He could sell the land to a third party in direct revocation, and I can learn about it. I can turn around and say, I accept. I bought the right to be able to accept that offer within that time period. And so a contract would still form. Only thing that's going to terminate the power of acceptance, of course, lapse of time. I mean, the 2 weeks pass, then we know that I've lost the power of acceptance, or the non-occurrence of a condition. So if we've said the only way I can accept is X, and that happens, that makes sense. The option wasn't designed to circumvent the condition. So let's take offeror death. If the offeror is necessary for performance, you're promising to paint my portrait, your famous portrait painter, your death per se may not terminate the power of acceptance under the death rule, but if you were necessary to perform, your death is actually the non-occurrence of a condition to acceptance. And so it would terminate my power of acceptance. But see, what I wanted to ask is what should students do you think, for these restatement rules, which a lot of states haven't followed, that are more aspirational on the bar exam? Should they be stressed about it? Should they go with the restatement, do you think, generally? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I get this a lot from students, can I use my notes from law school contracts to prepare for the bar? And I highly, as a general rule, discourage that. For the bar, you can have a much more basic understanding that is not as nuanced. And so what I would tell someone is, if you see facts that seem to say that this option contract should be enforceable or not, I would argue everything that I saw. I would state whatever rules I knew, and then bring in whatever facts I see that go for both sides of that issue. So if I see anything that looks like, this is actually to me, a little bit different from law school. In a bar essay, you're going to really use almost every single fact they give you. And a lot of professors will want you to pick and choose and be sort of selective in your factual analysis. But on the bar exam, if you see a fact and it doesn't constitute an effective rejection, I think you really have to talk about it. You have to analyze that, because the bar examiners have given you that fact to analyze. Even if it's something that's not effective, you have to discuss it, because the factual scenarios on the bar are much shorter. And so they do expect you to use more of those facts. And so analyze the legal implications of what has happened, but also analyze the non-occurrence of certain legal ramifications. So if you see an option contract and it doesn't have consideration, I mean, I think you really go in this slide is great for this, but these are the main points that you want to argue. And so if you don't know a nuanced perspective or an aspirational this or that or the other thing, and you just remember that this is arguable and you see some ambiguity, I think you talk about it. And this is where I think it pays to be a little bit aggressive, a little bit more confident. because you don't get credit for what you don't write. And I think a lot of times students are afraid to write something and sound dumb. And on the bar exam, I think you should be a bit more aggressive and a bit more write with confidence, and don't be so insecure about your knowledge.
Fake it till you make it. No, I'm suggesting you fake it. No, that's very good advice, which is that, I can't imagine it's a big problem if you say, well, they recited purported consideration and that's sufficient, the bar examiners are going to be impressed that that, right? And I guess if you say, well, but many states don't follow that, they might even be more impressed. So just, the more you give, the better. And I do agree with it. My guess is it's not so much about specifically knowing this is majority, this is minority, but just demonstrating that competence that you're recognizing these issues. You recognize there's these rules of law out there. Maybe some are competing, but the bar examiners, I assume that's what they're looking for. So that's very good advice. And one thing I want to mention about option contracts, going back to a prior episode, the mailbox rule. Remember, this is one of our exceptions. There are 3 exceptions to the mailbox rule. One, the offeror specifies it's effective at some other time, either upon maybe signing or upon receipt. Or number 2 was option contract. And number 3, we talked about in the prior episode, when a rejection is dispatched first. So keep in mind, and this is, boy, my students, they struggle with this when they forget about it. If you have an option contract, unless the offeror has specified that the mailbox rule is in play, the mailbox rule is not, which means the general rule is that if I tell you, you have until, you have 2 weeks or until June 7th, whatever, and you pay for that option, dropping it, dispatching acceptance on the deadline and having it arrive after the deadline is not effective. It does not work. It is only effective upon receipt. So watch out. You've got a renewal of a lease by 90 days before, and it's part of an option. You have the option to renew. That's considered an option contract. And so you've got to get that unless they've indicated the mailbox was in play. General rule is you've got to get that acceptance, that exercise that option to the offeror by the deadline, not just simply dispatching it. All right, actually, Steve, you know where we were? You were walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. I had offered you $100 to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. And this is hilarious, Steve. Of course, this sounds like an offer for a unilateral contract. I was just seeking performance from you, not a return promise. And Steve, this is hilarious. You started walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. It was a hot day. You were sweating. You were so proud of yourself that you'd made it as far as you did. And I had a little, I don't know, do drones speak now? Because I don't know, I had a little drone come in and I was, controlling it, and I don't know, it was like, maybe it was like the Cars video. Wasn't it like a fly with a little head with, remember that's Fly's video? Yeah, that Cars video, you probably don't remember. And I, a little drone with my head, and I say, I revoke my offer. And Steve, why it was so funny is because as I understood it, I, the offeror, generally can revoke an offer anytime prior to acceptance. And we know with an offer for a unilateral contract, it is not accepted until the offeree completes performance. So that's hilarious. But you know what? When something's really, really funny like that, courts tend to get bothered by it. And so what courts have said is when an offeree, when performance in response to an offer for unilateral contract takes time, or even if it doesn't take time, once I've tendered performance, let's say, or tender the beginning of it, but typically we're talking about when it takes time. Once the offeree starts performance, an option contract arises. The offer becomes irrevocable. And I know we're going to say, well, wait, this all sounds like a strange idea for an option contract, because where's the consideration? Where's the promise to keep it open? It's magic, Steve. We are going to infer a promise to keep it open once the offeree starts performing. And the consideration is the part performance. That's the consideration for the option. Let's face it. This is all just seems to me sort of a fiction to prevent the injustice of an offeror being able to revoke an offer once the offer has started performance in response to an offer for unilateral contract. But it is it is couched within this concept of option contract, and it becomes irrevocable. So the big dividing line is going to be, is the person simply preparing to perform, or is the person started performance? And that is not always so easy to figure out.
You know, and in my head, that's kind of blending into promissory estoppel a little bit, because I think on one hand, if the promisee has begun performance, that beginning of performance could be considered consideration for an option, but it could also be considered reliance, detrimental reliance on the promise to keep. Well, I guess there was really no, and you tell me, it can't be promissory estoppel because there was no promise. Am I wrong to say that?
I think so yeah, what happens, so this is a perfect segue to the second way to make a promise to keep an offer open, legally binding, promissory estoppel. So yeah, so this does get a little tricky. So the nice thing about number one, there's good and bad, right? Anytime you have one doctrine and another doctrine, they seem to be somewhat similar. You probably know there's good and bad for one and good and bad for the other. So with the option contract business, with starting to perform an offer for unilateral contract, the benefits are that the courts are going to automatically infer a promise to keep it open, whether it's implied in law or implied in fact, who knows, probably implied in law, but certainly implied. And we're going to say that the consideration is the start of performance. So it's a nice bright line. So yes, there's no doubt it is premised on a concern about detrimental reliance on the offer. But the nice thing about the business with this unilateral contract and the start of performance is it's a bright line. You do not have to talk about, is there detrimental reliance, how much? The minute you start performance, that is considered enough reliance to create the option contract. Promissory estoppel, the bad about the promissory estoppel and using that is that you do actually have to have an actual promise. Like, let's say the unilateral contract business is an implied in law promise to keep the offer open, which seems to make sense to me. With promissory estoppel, you need to have an actual promise. Now, it could be implied in fact, but typically we're talking about an actual promise. I mean, kind of hard to maybe find an implied in fact promise. Typically, you're typically talking about you need an actual promise. I promise to keep the offer open for 2 weeks. So that's sort of the bad news about it. But the good news about using promissory estoppel is that it applies to any detrimental reliance, even if that detrimental reliance is not the start of performance. So promissory estoppel can be used when it is a promise to keep the offer open, and the principal contract is for a bilateral contract. I promise to sell you my restaurant if you promise to pay me $100,000, and I promise to keep that offer open for 2 weeks. You couldn't use the start of performance unilateral contract business because, that's probably not a unilateral contract. We're probably gonna have a closing, and I want you to promise to pay me the money, and I promise to pay you and I promise to transfer ownership, and then the closing would be the performance, but we'd have a bilateral contract before that. So the good news with using promissory estoppel is that you can use it here if you detrimentally rely, and your detrimental reliance doesn't need to be a start of performance. It can be preparing to perform, but you do need a promise to keep the offer open. And the downside too is that all the elements, this is just standard promissory estoppel, Steve. So it's just your straight up section 90. We'll get to some weirdness in a second. Straight up section 90 now, which is you got to show that detrimental reliance was reasonably foreseeable to the promisor, that you would detrimentally rely before accepting, which is unusual because typically you wouldn't think people rely and then accept. You think they accept, then rely. And in addition, injustice you need the detrimental reliance, and then you need injustice would occur, which could be hard to show in some cases. So promissory estoppel is another way that you could use. Like, let's say it's an offer for a unilateral contract. I promise to keep it open, but there was just preparations to perform. You could go promissory estoppel on it, where you couldn't go that start of performance with the unilateral contract. So it's just different. It's better and worse in certain ways. It's going to be limited, though, to situations where it's foreseeable to me that you will detrimentally lie before you accept. And that's unusual, but it might happen if I make a promise to keep it open, and I know that you're planning on like getting a loan and getting financing and making efforts to get the financing and spending money to get the financing, or maybe doing things to put yourself in a position to accept. So it can happen, but it tends to be difficult to establish that it was foreseeable.
There was a bar essay a couple of years back with a contract for the sale of real property, and the buyer said, will you hold it open to give me an opportunity to go look at the property? And the seller says yes. And the buyer did go look at the property. And that was, I think, reasonably foreseeable that promise to hold the offer open was going to spur reliance to go look at the property for that period of time. And so that was an example of promissory estoppel being used, and it being that reliance being reasonably foreseeable because they actually had that conversation about looking at the property.
Absolutely. And then one of the big issues, it seems to me, that would flow from that is the reliance of a definite and substantial character, which is a factor that is important to courts. And so then it's like, okay, how much is it? How much reliance? How much are they out? And there is a Florida case. I know many of our listeners, they're not in law school in Florida, but there is a Florida case which applied promissory estoppel to a promise to keep the offer open. So it's not surprising that the bar examiners may have included something like that. I think it was very similar. I think it was a sale of land. And I can't remember what the reliance was, but so it wouldn't surprise me that the Florida bar examiners would ask a question like that when we have a case in Florida that deals with that. That's where they're going to go probably for a lot of their questions. So there's another type of promissory estoppel, which one professor jokingly called offer estoppel, which is similar. It's a species of promissory estoppel, but it is an implied, the restatement says it's an implied law promise. This is when I make you an offer, Steve. I never promise to keep it open, but I make you an offer, but it is reasonably foreseeable that you will rely upon my offer before you accept it. So notice here where we are not in the land of what you think of as your classic promissory estoppel, because I haven't promised to keep the offer open. I've just made an offer to you. Yeah, an offer includes, I guess, a promise within it, but is it a promise to keep? It's not a promise to keep the offer open. And what the restatement says, and what most courts say, is that if it is reasonably foreseeable to foresee that an offeree will detrimentally rely on an offer before they can accept, an injustice would occur, and the reliance is of a substantial nature, then it is binding for a reasonable time for the offeree to accept. Now, this is very unusual. This is very unusual because the general rule is you should accept, then rely. It is unusual to rely on an offer and then accept. That order is all wrong because you never know if the offer is going to be revoked. So if you make a promise to keep the offer open, it's more often would you foresee reliance, because now you're like, oh, well, yeah, maybe they're going to rely because they know that they don't need to be nervous about it being revoked. So they're more comfortable relying. But when it's just an offer, it would seem very unusual to foresee reliance before acceptance. Where this typically comes into play, and it's unusual, where it comes into play is when the offeror is aware that the offeree would have to do certain things to put themselves into a position to accept. And the classic example of this, and maybe probably one of the few situations where this would occur, is when a subcontractor submits a bid to a general contractor, and a bid is an offer typically, and the general contractor then, they don't want to accept the bid yet because the general contractor is soliciting bids to figure out their own bid to the landowner, the project owner. And they take all those bids, figure out their bid, and make their bid to the project owner. And so the general contractor doesn't want to accept the subcontractor's bid until they, the general contractor, know if they have the prime contract with the project owner. And so it's foreseeable by the subcontractor that the general contractor will have to detrimentally rely on the subcontractor's bid before being in a position to accept their bid. So it makes sense that you got to rely first, because I got to get the general contract, the prime contract, and then accept. And in those cases, the general rule is that it is foreseeable. And therefore, if the general contractor uses the subcontractor's bid, which is in and of itself generally not an acceptance of the bid, and then comes back and gets the prime contract, the general contractor is given a reasonable time to accept. They can't dawdle and they can't bid shop, and they lose the ability to accept, the power of acceptance. But if they don't dawdle, they act promptly, don't bid shop, try to find a better deal, come back and say, I accept. If the subcontractor, before they say that, says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm revoking because I realize I just made an error in my bid, there is an option contract, or well, I shouldn't say option con, or it's not a contract really, because it's using promissory estoppel. But what courts have said is that there is an implied in law promise to keep that offer open. There's foreseeable, there's detrimental reliance. If it is substantial and injustice would occur, the offeree should have a reasonable time to accept.
That sounds like a special carve out for the nature of those construction contracts and the nature of the parties involved. And, you know, if you're routinely submitting bids to general contractors, this is something you should probably know before you let a bid fly out of your hands. And so this seems to make logical sense as sort of an exception carved out for this special commercial situation.
You know, so it's not so limited, but in reality, it probably is just about so limited. And I think that's right, because it's one of those unusual situations in which, wait a second, it is understandable that you would rely first and then accept. So yeah, so it is sort of that's what you're looking for. I mean, it would be pretty unusual to see it. It could happen in other situations, but it would be pretty unusual. So the last one is UCC's firm offer. Now, this only applies to Article 2 of the UCC. This is not a common law rule. And as we've talked about in the past, in general, formality is not enough to make a promise legally binding. We talked a little bit about the restatement's position that there should be a way to have formality make an option contract arise through a recitation of purported consideration, but many states, most states, they don't follow that, but it is in the restatement. But Article 2, we know, has been adopted by 49 of our 50 state legislatures. So Article 2 is the law, and Article 2 did include a way to use formality to make a promise to keep an offer open legally binding. And it's called a firm offer. But in my sense, a firm offer is just a fancy name for a binding option or an option contract. I mean, there's not going to be consideration here. So maybe contract isn't the right word, but it's just the same. It's just a different phrase for a binding option. And the UCC firm offer rule applies, obviously, when it is a contract for the sale of goods. Remember, Article 2 has got to apply here, not the common law. So source of law here, that very first lesson we did, very important. If Article 2 applies, an offer to buy or sell goods by a merchant, in which the merchant, in a signed writing, signed by the merchant in a writing, gives written assurance that they will keep the offer open, not revoke it, for a period of time, is legally binding. Now, actually, they don't even need to do a period of time. If they don't do a period of time, it is going to be reduced down a maximum of 3 months. Even if they specify longer, it will be reduced down to, if they don't specify any time, it is for a reasonable time, which is not necessarily 3 months. If they specify a longer time, the maximum is 3 months. And this is a way to encourage the offeree to rely upon the written assurance by the merchant that the offer is going to be kept open. No consideration is necessary, none at all. No detrimental reliance is necessary. The formality of it makes it legally binding. Keep in mind that if you do have consideration, It doesn't need to be in writing. It may be if we're talking about the statute of frauds, $500 or more, but not under this rule. This particular rule, the writing requirement for this rule and having to be a merchant, this only applies if you don't have consideration. If you have an option contract created through way number one, the traditional way, you don't need to worry about, is somebody a merchant? Is it in assigned writing? You've got a contract for consideration. And unless the statute of frauds applies, you don't need to have it in a writing. And keep in mind that the just the person who is promising to keep it open, they're the only one that has to be a merchant. And keep in mind here that a merchant here includes not only a merchant as to goods, which is somebody who specializes in goods of those kind, but also a merchant as to business practices, which under this rule would be basically any business person for most part. So any business person acting in their so-called mercantile capacity, not acting in their, layperson, I'm buying fishing tackle for my own vacation, they're buying it in their business capacity, would be considered a merchant here under this rule. And that is our UCC firm offer rule.
And I just want to throw in that there's a very confusing point to my students. They tend to not understand the difference and the interrelation between the option contract and the UCC firm offer. And I think big picture, step back, the common law is everywhere where a statute isn't. So the firm offer rule under the UCC is a creature of statute. And so if the firm offer rule doesn't apply, the option contract is sort of waiting there in the shadows, waiting to apply in the absence of a statute. And so keep that in mind, that you could have a contract for the sale of movable goods, and the UCC generally applies, but option contracts are still there if the UCC provision doesn't directly apply.
That's absolutely right. Very good thing for students to keep in mind. Article 2, for the most part, is going to be adding additional rules. We know they changed some things. We'll talk about the perfect tender rule. We know mirror image rules out, but many of them, there's still a lot of gaps. And the UCC firm offer rule was not designed to supplant and basically control the whole field of how options are created. It was to provide an additional way on top of the traditional common law ways to create an option. And so not only do we know that even if you don't satisfy the firm offer rule, that you can go the traditional way with consideration, the comments to the firm offer rule make reference to promissory estoppel. So promissory estoppel, even number 2, could be used if there was detrimental reliance and not consideration. So absolutely, this is just an additional way that's a benefit for offerees. If it happens to be Article 2, you can use this. You don't have to. Don't panic. If you don't have the firm offer, fall back, fill the gaps with these other ways. So we have the option, Steve, to end this podcast now. Shall we exercise the option to end it?
I accept.
You accept. All right. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed lesson number 8 on option contracts. We will see you next time on K-Talk.